There we go. It's official.
It's official. Hello, everybody. So welcome to our latest BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG Weekday Night Bites, which is just a fancy term. It's not fancy, is it? That's a lie. Which is just a daft term for events. And I'm really pleased tonight that we are hosting the launch of New Blood: Critical Approaches to Contemporary Horror, which is out now from the University of Wales Press.
It is indeed.
As part of their horror series. We have with us this evening three editors: Joe Hickinbottom from the University of Surrey, Eddie Falvey from Plymouth College of Art, and Jonathan Wroot from the University of Greenwich. And I'm going to hand over to them, but congratulations on the book, guys, and really looking forward to this evening.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Just to let people know that if you want to ask any questions in the chat at any point, that's fine. We'll make sure that they get to the panel and they'll get around to them in a while. Thanks, guys. Good luck.
That's great. Thank you so much, Laura. So hello, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you also to Laura, Shelley, Kate, and your colleagues in the BAFTSS Horror Special Interest Group for agreeing to host this online event. Thank you so much for that opportunity. Thank you also in particular as well, I almost forgot to mention this, to Laura for her glowing endorsement of the book, as well as, of course, because I know some of them might be here this evening, Ian Hunter, Ian Robert Smith, Andy Willis, and Harry Benshoff. Thank you for all those glowing endorsements that the book has got, including, of course, Laura. Thanks again for that and the opportunity this evening. So myself, Eddie and Joe are pleased to announce, as I said, the publication as of today of the new volume we've co-edited, New Blood: Critical Approaches to Contemporary Horror. I'm going to pass over to my co-editors, Joe and Eddie, in just a moment for some quick introductions. But first, I wanted to thank them in particular for bringing me on board for this project, because they had the idea first and they brought me on back in, I couldn't believe this earlier when I checked my emails earlier, but it was back in July 2017 when they first made me aware of their ideas and were drafting the book proposal to University of Wales Press. So that was 3.5 years ago. Can you believe it? It's crazy. So they came to me just as I had finished co-editing 2 collections on home media research, and being a long-time horror fan, I was more than happy to come on board, help with drafting the proposal, obviously, provide a chapter, and then help to steer the process later on as much as my schedule has been able to allow. And so thank you again for the opportunity. I'm glad to see this project has allowed you both to go on to establish yourselves on your own career paths in higher education. So I'm going to stop going on now. That's enough from me for the moment. We should also have a chance to say cheers and hopefully raise a glass to the book. Finally, announcing that the book is out there and it's available from University Wales Press's website and other publication outlets. I'll just quickly mention as well, because I did promise to the publisher that I mentioned this today. If you do go to University of Wales Press's website to purchase a copy of the book, if you're interested before the end of February, you can use the discount code HORROR20 to get 20% off the purchase price. How's that for a special offer for you? Anyway,
yeah, it's also worth jumping in there and saying I think that discount is available to any of the books that are in the series, and I really would encourage everyone to check out the rest of the series. There's some really great stuff in there, like recently released and forthcoming.
There really is, yeah. UWP also have a whole web page dedicated to the other horror studies books, and there are some great ones in there. I know some other people attending here at this evening's event are also involved with those other books. So yeah, please do check those out too. So as I said, that's enough from me, I think, for the moment. Eddie and Joe, do you want to give a quick introduction, remarks on the book? Are you as happy as me that it's finally out there?
Yes, yes, very much so.
I was really hoping to be able to hold up a copy like this. I've been checking my post.
Yeah, no, it's been delayed, like everything at the moment. It's delayed through the post, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah, no, really happy. It's been a long time coming, and it's I'm really happy with how it turned out, and we've got some really great chapters in there. We do have several people from the book in attendance this evening, so it is worth sort of giving a brief introduction to them. So, David, you're with us, is that right?
I am, yes.
Hi, David.
Hi, David.
Thanks for joining us. So everyone, this is David Church, who actually opens the book, big old chapter number 1. So yeah, it's great. It's great to have you. Thanks for joining us this evening, David.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Who else do we have? We've got Steve with us this evening. Is that right?
Steve Jones as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah, hi Harvey, I'm here.
Hi. Good to see you,
Hi,
Steve.
Good to see you.
Hi, Steve.
Abby, are you with us this evening?
Hi everybody. Yeah, I'm here.
Good to see you.
Hi, Abby.
Hi, Abby.
Lindsay.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Lindsay.
Hey, Lindsay.
Good to see you, Lindsay. Thank you for joining us. Tom, are you with us?
Hello.
Yeah, that's Tom.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining us. And Neil, I've gone through this in order that they show up on the contents page. Yeah.
Oh, great idea.
Neil with us.
There's Neil.
Neil, was
Yes,
it?
I'm here, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Good to see you all as always.
Oh, good. Neil started the toast.
Evening,
I'll
Neil.
join him.
Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you, Neil. Cheers.
That's a good excuse. Right, so great. Right, well, thanks for joining us. Hopefully there'll be opportunities to talk a little bit more about your contributions and the work that you're currently conducting at the moment. Obviously, this book has been a long time coming, so we're several years ahead of where we were when we put this thing together. I think I actually remember hounding Johnny Walker. I think you're with us, right, Johnny? I seem to remember hounding you at an event in 2017 in Canterbury, where you did a keynote, because I'd recently seen a flyer for this UWP horror series headed by Xavier Mendic, who I think is also with us this evening and has been doing some really sterling work on this series across the board. So it's been a real pleasure to be involved. This is my first sort of publication. I was still a year away from the end of my PhD when I started on this back in 2017. So, I've kind of been learning a lot as I've gone along, and I'm just really pleased that we've got such a sort of a diverse collection of chapters there that are sort of like, commenting on existing horror studies and sort of pushing it into new directions. So Joe, do you want to jump in here? Or
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in some respects, I'm kind of an imposter this evening because I kind of moved out of academia quite a while ago. I currently work at the University of Surrey. And I do outreach work with students who are underrepresented in higher education. So I still work in higher education, but I work with children from year 5 primary school up to year 13. So it's very difficult to have a conversation with them about the topics of the book. But they are never ceases to amaze me how impressed they are when you mention that I just edited a book. So I think. Yeah, I mean, both John and Eddie have said this. This started a long time ago. For me personally, started at a very kind of different stage in my life. I'd finished my PhD at Exeter. I was working up in a museum in Bradford to help pursue my partner's career in museums. But when Eddie kind of got in touch with me and said, "Hey, do you want to get involved in this book?" I kind of immediately got sucked back in, and I think it really is always just so nice to talk to people who, even if you don't agree with their views on films or their tastes, just the passion for something that many other people, and I don't need to tell this to anyone here, that many other people would find very strange or repulsive or weird. So I'm quite happy that we've managed to get all that strange and weird stuff into this book, which has been great. And it's been so great to talk to so many of you, albeit online. You're probably very sick of seeing emails from myself and John and Eddie, but thank you very much for pushing through with us. So it's going to be, as like Eddie said, I would have been happy to hold it up. In a perverse turn of events, you can probably get it tomorrow if you order it off Amazon, whereas we'll just wait for our copies to come through second class Royal Mail post probably. But that's fine, it'll be here soon.
contributors, keep an eye on your mailboxes. If you're in the UK, sadly, if you're not in the UK, then you're going to have to wait until University of Chicago Press start shipping them. So, apologies,
sorry,
David. So I bet some of you are starting to wonder what's in the book. You know, we've done the kind of the introductory spiel. So, if it's all right with you, and by all means say so if you'd rather not, I'd sort of like to just quickly give the contributors who are in attendance an opportunity to sort of say hello, mention what it is that they get up to in their chapter, and maybe tell us about what they're working on at the moment. So is that all right, David? Would you be happy to do that?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Over to you, David.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you, David.
Okay. So my chapter is something of an attempt to try to define in some way some of the formal traits, but then also the discursive conversation around post-horror films or elevated horror films, or as I call them in this version of the chapter, kind of new independent prestige horror films, which is a very unwieldy term, admittedly. So what I was trying to do in this chapter is just kind of figure out, okay, how can we situate these films in relation to the larger genre and see them as part of this longer tradition of prestige horror films that obviously has both Hollywood variants and then also kind of art cinema variants. But then I was very interested in looking at, how this particular cycle of films gained such attention since 2013 or thereabouts, how it's come to seem more of like an emergent cycle, and maybe it's a divergent cycle at this point, maybe it's on its way out, possibly. But looking at basically just the rise and fall of this cycle of films, and some of the debates around how genre fans have taken them up versus how more populist audiences have tended to reject these films. And so looking at some of the debates around them, basically. And so this chapter I've since blown up and expanded, and it's become sort of the first two chapters of a book called Post Horror, which is coming out at the end of next month. So it's a study that's all about these particular films, I guess.
Yeah, that's University of Edinburgh Press, right? Is that correct?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So that's I'm really looking forward to that one. So it's nice that you kind of use this chapter here as like a stepping stone to that monograph project. So that's really exciting. I think from the very beginning we knew we needed someone to step in and sort of deal with this kind of contentious issue of, how do we talk about horror today? What do we do with these films that are called prestige horror or highbrow horror or post horror? There's at least a dozen different names that have been sort of circulated. David, you do great work in that chapter at kind of giving us this overview, and whilst exploring some of the tropes and sort of this tension that emerged between critics and popular audiences. So yeah, it's a really great piece of work. So I'm very happy that we had you contributing that. Great.
Just to add there, Eddie, I think I'd speak for all three of us that when we were looking at how to sort of arrange this book, we all were in agreement from the beginning that David's chapter would open, because I think it really sets the tone. And particularly I appreciate when you were first writing this, David, I mean, that you couldn't really get away from this concept of post horror or prestige horror. And I think it's still relevant now, and it's definitely sets the tone for the whole book. So well, thank you very much, David.
Thank you as well.
Steve, would you be willing to jump in and do something similar?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's been a long time since I was trying to work out how long it was. It's been since I wrote the chapter, and it's probably been about 2.5 years or something.
We're sorry.
So this is the way academic publishing is. I suppose if David was setting the tone for the book, then I'm doing what I always do, which is lower the tone.
Better.
Well, David's talking about the highbrow. I suppose I'm talking about the ultra lowbrow. So I'm talking about extremity, and from what I remember, I'm doing a number of things with the concept of extremity. One is to outline how it's being used as a marketing tool and as a discursive tool, especially by critics and censors. I've written on this area so much now, I might be getting confused with something else I've written, but I think this is what I was doing. I was then thinking about how critics ignore the peripheries of the genre, so they tend to focus on the mainstream, and so they ignore the micro budget areas where extremity really happens. So we're talking about the other of another genre, as it were. In doing so, critics then misrepresent what the genre is, or have a very narrow focus of what the genre is, and that waylays the way that extremity is used in some respect in those discourses, because really then we've got to start asking questions like extreme compared with what exactly, and that's really what I'm banging on about as like when I'm talking about extremity as a conceptual tool, is that it tends to be used as if it's a marker of something objective, whereas actually it's a relativistic term. It's always in relation to something else. From there, I start talking about how the pejorative discourse, the way that critics and censors use the term extreme, ends up shaping academic discussion in several ways. So because of the nature of peer reviewing and the ways that journals work to try and capture a wide readership, we end up often being led by the kinds of controversies that are raised within the press or by critics or by censors who ban certain films. And so that ends up shaping the extent to which we talk about the genre. And I think that's really what I'm keen on asking us to think about, is that I understand that it's difficult to talk about a number of really obscure films, but to ignore, say, the work of someone like Olaf Ittenbach, who's probably had as many words written about him in academia as he's made films, seems criminal compared with the amount of words that have been spilt over the Human Centipede series, for instance. And I'm totally guilty of contributing to that. It's just that I think we need to be aware of the way those discourses are shaped by the systems of academic publishing and the way we're being driven by critics and censors. So it's been a long time since I've written on that, but I've written about it in various different ways. And since writing this, I've been the head of subject in the department. So I've been doing nothing but admin for so many years now that I haven't written basically anything since this. So I'm currently on sabbatical for the first time in about 5 years. So I'm writing a book on the meta-modern slasher film, which has absolutely nothing to do with this now.
Oh, it sounds great though.
Brilliant.
What is a meta-modern slasher film? Can you tell us, or is that?
Oh, I'm curious too.
Really, so I start off with the idea of the postmodern slasher film, and half the book is really starting to claim that there's not that much postmodern about the postmodern slasher film. But really what sets the postmodern slasher film up is a kind of cynical tone. And more recently, we get a move away from that sort of cynicism and flippancy towards something that's underpinned with sincerity or a genuine desire to innovate rather than looking backwards. That's it in a nutshell.
It sounds great. Looking forward to
Thank
that. Yeah, it's a really interesting chapter that you offered to the book, because it kind of pairs up, as you say, very nicely with David, sort of for looking at kind of the other end of the horror spectrum, and it kind of draws attention to the way in which the reception of horror has been engineered by these sort of discourses that sort of are happening both within the academy but also outside of it. So when we're sort of turned towards films that are sort of given sort of this prestige status as being kind of something more serious than horror ought to be, or often is appreciated to be, when we're talking, when actually sometimes we're talking about films that aren't actually too far departed from sort of standard horror fare. Like Get Out sort of has a lot of the hallmarks that we're familiar with from a lot of preceding horror films, whereas something like A Ghost Story might be more of a slow cinema departure. And I know both of those come up in David's chapter, but also kind of like the way in which the moral outrage is sort of being engineered as well at the other end of things, which I suppose is one of the things that you touch upon in your chapter in really interesting ways. So yeah. We've had a question actually. Laura's dropped me a message from Johnny saying, going forward, what do you see as being the most significant methodological approaches to the study of the horror film, and why? So I don't know if this one's any of the contributors or any of my other co-editors want to jump in on that. Steve, do you have any thoughts about methodological approaches to horror films, or do you want to pass it back over?
I'll say one thing, which is that one of my I suppose this is sort of a pet peeve, and it comes from having dealt for so long with rejecting psychoanalysis and still seeing, and no offense to people who are doing psychoanalysis incidentally, but still seeing people who aren't that familiar with the genre commenting on peer-reviewed articles saying, well, you haven't mentioned Barbara Creed. And it's like, well, Barbara Creed has nothing to do with it. I realize that it's a very famous piece of work, But if that's all you know about horror studies, then we need something new. So my view is that I think we could do with being in touch with more of what's going on in contemporary human geography, for instance. For some places where the theory is being coined, I think we need to be much more on top of that, rather than taking things that have, this is part of cultural studies more broadly, is that I think we end up with things about second or third hand, so it feels like we're quite far behind, more than we should be, in my opinion.
Yeah, I certainly think stuff that goes beyond sort of, just your primary textual analysis that sort of can properly situate it within sort of wider sort of discursive and sort of production contexts. I think that certainly should be a goal of horror studies moving forwards. I totally, I know I've got friends and colleagues who will chastise me for agreeing with the sort of like this turn against psychoanalysis, but it has been a long time coming. I mean, psychoanalysis and horror studies has been going on for a very long time now. So yeah. Does anyone else among the either the contributors, even if you haven't spoken yet, do you want to jump in on that, or John or Joe? Do you want to?
I'll just quickly mention, I mean, I'm a fan of this perspective because I keep using it myself, and I know a lot of other people that have logged on today do the same in terms of looking at, and Steve has just mentioned it as well, in terms of looking at reception studies and discourse analysis, has been explored a lot in the horror genre, and I think a lot of, maybe I'm making too much of assumption here, but I agree with a lot of the points that Steve's made, in terms of, there should be this turn away from psychoanalysis and deep textual analysis, but also it does have its place. But we should look at other views as well. I'm sometimes guilty of staying in kind of the reception studies and discourse analysis kind of lane or slot, I guess. It's just what I feel most comfortable with, but I do think we need to explore more, though I know this has been done elsewhere, maybe the audience perspective. I think that's maybe important to do with some recent horror studies. I know that's touched on very briefly in some of the chapters in the book. I know you briefly mentioned some audience reception in your chapter, Eddie, with some of the films that you talk about and their reception online compared to what the critics are saying. And David also mentions this in his chapter. That should maybe worth exploring a bit more, but I'm aware that people are already doing that in other fields. So that's my brief view on this.
I find that people are, sorry, Joe, you're about to jump in.
Well, yeah, I was just, agreeing with Steve and kind of what you guys have said, really, is that I think one thing that with the book, I wouldn't say we set out to do, but we always had this idea that it would be cinema focused, film focused, but then naturally other sort of media would creep in. There's other works in the series that kind of give much more focus to things like video games, for instance. But I think definitely in terms of looking at methodologies going forward with horror, I think it's looking at transmedia, and then like Jess's chapter does that really well, looking at folklore, gothic horror, and how things kind of cross different boundaries in terms of trying to look at the differences between an online creepypasta, which is just a text-based story, and then the entrance of that into pop culture with kind of relatively big budget productions. And I think when you're looking at those sorts of areas, it's important not to just rely on it, as Steve said, the sort of the seminal texts, as it were, and looking at different types of media and the different ways that people engage with them calls for different approaches, and might call for something that you as a writer aren't that familiar with. So I think it's going to take some people to take some risks, as it were, to really kind of borrow and be influenced by different areas of kind of academia in a way that I don't think film always does. I don't want to kind of put my foot in it if there's anyone who's doing it, particularly in the audience right now. But I think definitely that sort of trying to look to other areas of theory. I think. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think there's something about the way in which people come to horror as well, that you're already kind of invested in the pleasures of it, and like this, and the kind of the effects of horror are something that you're okay with. You're not too, So when I think people have quite like a personal sort of approach to horror studies when they sort of come into it as maybe undergrads or sort of early postgrad, moving through to PhD, where it's like it's very much kind of a part of their identity. I know for a long time I really did kind of think of myself, you know, as predominantly a horror fan, and you know, this is and you know, I kind of liked the transgressive nature of the material and stuff. And actually, there's an interesting sort of point of crossover here, you know, because obviously the three of us, in some capacity, you mentioned this, Joe, about, you know, whether or not you could talk to your students that you're dealing with about this material and stuff, is from, you know, more of like a pedagogical perspective, like, you know, questions of how you teach horror and teaching transgressive materials are really interesting, because for the ways in which they kind of intersect with exactly what Steve was talking about, which is this kind of external discursive construction of outrage, as, you know, this thing that, you know, you can't just kind of drop a horror film in the middle of a module without kind of prefacing it as a strong, you know, for having stronger content. I don't know if anyone actually has got any thoughts on, you know, teaching horror movies. I'm sure, Steve, you must have done quite a lot of that. Neil, I know you have as well. David, do you teach much horror, or is it all, you know, Russian formalism?
I do teach a class on American horror cinema, and so I have had the ability to do some sort of you know, things in that regard. But I still try to kind of pepper in some horror films every now and again into other classes. So I teach a gender and sexuality in pop culture course, and I tend to try to work in a movie like It Follows or something like that in there as a way of trying to get the students to think a little more critically about, you know, kind of sexual ethics or rape culture or things of that nature. And then also I tend to use films like that in my intro to cinema course as well, as a way of thinking about, you know, cinematography and how cinematography works in a very sort of active way. You know, I find certain films to be useful tools that I can kind of reuse again and again across a range of different courses, like It Follows, especially since a number of students seem to have seen that one.
Yeah, I wonder if it's because of like the intensity of the material that people sort of like just, you know, feel that they have something so profound to say about, you know, history and society and, you know, just like human condition. Like I remember, you know, as being a young viewer of horror, I felt this sort of profound sort of like feeling of like, oh yeah, these films are saying something, partly because of the shocking material, but also I think because of my engagement with them. I think it's an interesting thing. I haven't actually had the pleasure of teaching horror myself, so I don't, you know, I'm not quite too sure like how you can get away with that. Steve, have you ever had a chance to teach any of the more extreme stuff you're talking about, or do you find that the censorship things crazy?
I haven't really taught that much on horror. I've taught on pornography without showing any pornography, but I haven't taught that much on on the horror end of the scale. I did once give a talk for Johnny Walker at De Montfort, where I had a screening of one of the August Underground films, and he didn't really know what the content was going to be, and that was we got away with it. It was poor judgment, Johnny. It was.
It wasn't like a 9 o'clock screening in the morning or anything like that, was it?
No, it was an evening thing, but he had to keep an eye out for anyone wandering the corridors, just in case.
I remember it was bad enough once having a 9:30 screening of The Exorcist, and that really woke people up. But I'm just thinking about something like the August Underground trilogy. I think you just take the rest of the day off.
You've reminded me of an anecdote from my teaching. When I was an hourly paid lecturer working at the University of Worcester, I was very grateful to the staff there, particularly Michael Coven, for giving me this opportunity of heading his cult and exploitation module. And I thought, right, this year I'm going to gear it to what I know. And I started off the module. I think it was an afternoon class, not a morning screening, but started off the module by getting them to watch Tetsuo the Iron Man. And said, this is where we're starting, and you know, if you can't handle this, you might not be able to handle the whole module. So that was my idea with taking over that module, and most of the students did stick with it, so that was fun. But what I found also is, I'm seeing this in the chat as well, just quickly peeking in on the chat every now and again, some people kind of shoehorn in horror to other modules that stick into wider themes, and I realize I've done this this year actually. With a lesson on reception studies coming up, I've decided to get students to watch Battle Royale, so I'm looking forward to what they think there. That'll be my first year's. And in a lesson on authorship, we're going to handily discuss, because also the publication times in quite well, we're going to look at Catherine Bigelow in Near Dark, So another excuse to watch a horror film there. So sometimes you can find the ways of shoehorning these things into modules about wider subjects. So looking forward to.
I'm gonna plug Stacey Abbott's great BFI class.
It's fantastic. Yeah.
So I'm gonna steer the conversation back in a second, because I can see the chat going crazy. We've had one comment here that's been shared to me by Laura from Reese Jones. Thanks, Reese, for your comment. I think something we need to do alongside that turn away from the psychoanalytic depth model is start doing work on assessing the potential erasures of these more orthodox and well-known theoretical models. Is start doing work on assessing the potential erasures that these more orthodox and well-known theoretical models have potentially encouraged, and what they encourage us as horror scholars to erase in our analysis of the genre, which, if anyone is interested in discussing in more depth, we'll be discussing on in detail in the Politics of Horror PhD workshop next month. So that's a plug for next month's event as well. I think that's really important, and you know, sort of like a long tangent from that initial question from Johnny there, but it's clearly quite you know, an invigorating topic of discussion. So we don't actually, I've seen lots of great stuff popping up in the chat about people having experiences teaching Issue the Killer and Get Out. I think it's really interesting to, you know, like to hear that these things are being taught outside of modules specifically on horror, because there is kind of like a sense sometimes I feel that like horror has to be contained within its own borders rather than kind of like incorporated into more general sort of like, you know, unless it's like a genre studies module. So there seems to be some really interesting stuff there. Creed and Clover are getting mentions also. Okay, so we don't actually have Xavier Mendic with us today, but you know, to move through chronologically, his chapter deals with his experiences heading up Cine XS, which I'm sure many people in attendance here have either spoken at or attended over the years. It's a really great event. We had the luxury actually of being there last year and presenting on aspects of the research we were doing for this. So Xavier, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, you know, one of the leading writers on cult cinema, it talks about his experiences of sort of like traversing those spaces between the academic conference and the sort of the popular film festival. And Cine XS is a really fascinating case study for that. And it's this really lovely sort of anecdotal sort of like commentary on sort of how these two spaces kind of interestingly sort of collapse into one another in the context of horror studies, which I think sort of goes back to what I was saying a minute ago about personal investment and sort of feeding into sort of academic practice. So that's a really interesting one to think about. Ever so briefly, because we do have other contributors waiting in the wings, if we move through the book chronologically, we've got our own, my co-editors, Joe and then John, their chapters. Joe, can you give us a really brief outline of your chapter?
Yeah. So it's a reception studies approach essentially to Takashi Miike, who I've been writing on since I started my degree in 2007. So I kind of
Thank you. How old?
Yeah. So going through kind of years and years and years of thinking about Miike and writing on Miike. I think anyone who's familiar with Miike or has written on Miike before, I know Lindsay has. He changes all the time, and the way that he's approached and marketed and sold changes all the time. So I got to the point when writing the chapter of kind of seeing just how prominent the kind of framing him as a horror auteur, as a master of horror, how prominent that was, regardless of what he was producing at that given time. And yeah, so I kind of traced the history of Miike's horror reputation all the way from Audition and Itchy the Killer up to kind of Masters of Horror and, you know, One Missed Call and those films. And yeah, it's quite funny looking back at the chapter now and seeing that, you know, horror, it still has a bit of a legacy with Miike in terms of how he's received in the West. But if anyone who's familiar with him knows that his current output, he's mostly overseeing these sort of children's TV shows that are designed to sell merchandise to small children. So, you know, he's nothing if not diverse. But yeah, so essentially I take a kind of reception approach there, looking at marketing, looking at I think along the lines of Steve as well, that kind of looking at how extreme this kind of very vague category has been used. I mean, you know, with Mike from the days of Tartan, Major Extreme up until now. So yeah, that's probably mine in a nutshell.
Another one of these chapters about sort of external things impacting the way in which horror is being received. You know, it's a really great piece of writing there, if you don't mind me sort of bigging it up, Joe, which kind of brings together sort of various different ways of thinking about horror. Also talks about television. You know, I know you said earlier we have more of a cinema focus. That is largely true, but there's at least 2 or 3 chapters. Yeah, there's 3 chapters with at least like a reasonable amount of attention being shown to TV as well. So apologies for you know, to any of you people who are really hoping for a lot of TV. There isn't a ton, but there is a great book on the series due by Stacey Abbott and Lorna Jowett in the next couple of months, I believe, which is all about TV horror. So, you know, when you buy a copy of this immediately afterwards, you can also pre-order a copy of that one. So yeah, it's a really great chapter in there as well about the sort of discursive function of the auteur, which, you know, comes up time and time again more recently with, you know, Suspiria and Halloween both kind of having sort of non-horror auteurs attached to them as well. So, and I know you talk about that in the chapter. So,
well, I think it's, you know, what you say in terms of those external forces is definitely a theme throughout the book, really. I mean, there's fantastic textual analysis throughout, but I think definitely something that's picked up on a lot. Again, Steve mentioned this earlier, and what Steve said about like how academic publishing kind of frames horror is very similar to what Xavier Mendic says and looks at with his own conference. And yeah, I mean, you know, not to push textual analysis away, but I know me and John share views on particularly looking at how East Asian film and horror has been kind of marketed and sold, and it's, you know, so often just fed through so many external forces. And it was interesting when the book came together to kind of see that come through in so many chapters on different types of horror. I think that's probably something we can maybe talk about a little bit as well when we look at subgenres in a little bit. But, yeah.
Can we swing it over to you, John, to give us a quick intro to your contribution to the book? And
most definitely. I mean, it links to Joe's because again, I'm talking about more horror films from Japan, but also it ties into the similar themes and subjects that Joe's talking about. The clue's really in the title, really, with my chapter, Bloody Muscles on VHS, When Asia Extreme Met the Video Nasties, because the key case study is this weird and wonderful film that I encourage everyone to seek out. Mainly because of the title, Bloody Muscle Bodybuilder in Hell. It is as crazy as it sounds. It took the poor guy that made it almost 10 years to make it on such a low budget. It's completely, you know, he is the definition of an amateur filmmaker. And when Terracotta, a UK distributor, got hold of this film, they thought it had such a grainy aesthetic similar to a VHS film. They did, amazingly, in 2017, release this on a limited edition VHS run. And, you know, very much use this tongue-in-cheek marketing gimmick that this was a you know, a supposedly forgotten video nasty that just also happened to be a J horror film. It has been classed that way as well. So I look at the different discourses used there in the marketing and also the reception of that film. So again, kind of staying in my lane that I mentioned earlier in research in relation to that film and just unpacking, you know, what those discourses are saying and how they're, interestingly, it does work. It's an effective marketing ploy, but also at the same time, you know, very anachronistic and contrasting things that they're mashing together there in terms of the J horror boom and the video nasties trend, but making it work essentially for what that distribution label Terracotta did there in 2017.
Yeah, John, would it be right? Would I be fair to say that you've basically been building an entire career as justification for your burgeoning DVD collection at this point? It's pretty much it, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Especially if we, you know, you could argue this with a lot at the moment, especially all the Zatoichi DVDs I've got at the moment, because that's the next project I'm working on, is the Zatoichi, the Blind Swordsman book. I'm hoping to be the first person to have covered the whole history of the franchise when that book comes out, although knowing my previous luck with publications and even just handing in student work, often my deadlines would clash when the new book on the subject just came out. So hopefully that won't happen.
It's always the way.
It's always the way, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I've written a lot also about certain distribution labels like Third Window and Terracotta in the past. Maybe I'll move away from them in future. Maybe I'll just find out that their new releases are so weird and wonderful and interesting that I'll stick with that. Because as you handily pointed out today, unfortunately, I've forgotten, the capacity of my laptop camera, but I can't show off my nerdy horror t-shirt today. I don't have a bloody muscle bodybuilder in hell one, but I do have a One Cut of the Dead one, another awesome Japanese horror film that I've recommended. And you've pointed out to me, I should have written about that movie really, other than Bloody Muscle. But
honest, there will be other
chapter to read.
There will be other scholarship on One Cut of the Dead, but there won't necessarily be other scholarship coming on Bloody Muscle Bodybuilders.
Well, we'll wait and see. It was an interesting chapter to write. I hope it does, act as a good touchstone for that certain point in UK and also Japanese cinema history at that time. We'll wait and see, what people think of the chapter.
Yeah, it's great. And it kind of really taps into one of the sort of overarching questions of the book, which is about new modes of reception for horror media, but also types of consumption as well. And this is work I know that Kate, who's with us this evening, who's hosting us this evening, knows a thing or two about. But the sort of the prestige releases of horror films for a sort of an audience with certain sort of like connoisseurship credentials, or at least tries to cultivate that themselves. So you're using the example of Terracotta there, but Arrow Video, Vinegar Syndrome, all of these other things that it doesn't matter if I own it twice already. If someone's going to charge me 50 quid and put it in a nice box, it's already pre-ordered.
Kate will be glad to know I've referred to her work in the chapter, and also the work of Mark McKenna, who I was very sad, unfortunately, circumstances were what they were. And I missed out his book launch earlier in the week, where I know he's talking about something very similar in his new book on
Marketing the Video Nasties, right?
Marketing the Video Nasties. So yeah, this chapter as well is hopefully seen as very much of the zeitgeist, where we're still looking back to that era, and it still seems to be shaping a lot of how the horror genre is shaped and received, especially in the UK at the moment, in terms of the video nasties. Will their effects ever dwindle? That famous period from horror history. Maybe, maybe not. We'll just have to wait and see. Personally, I hope not, but we'll see.
Dun, dun, dun. Okay, yeah. So moving on to the next chapter. That one. Unfortunately, Matt Hills cannot be with us, but Matt gives us perhaps the most TV focused chapter of the collection, streaming Netflix original horror, Black Mirror, Stranger Things, and datafied TV horror. It's a really great piece of scholarship on sort of changing modes of exhibition and horror consumption. So he sort of looks at Black Mirror as kind of being a previously not Netflix original show that was sort of picked up by Netflix after a few seasons, and sort of thinks about that in relation to Stranger Things, which is really sort of tapping into the sort of self-evident cult potential of the horror genre, just like in general, and that's kind of a topic that's explored in Xavier Mendic's chapter earlier as well, is these kind of this relationship between cult and horror. So that's a really interesting chapter there. I won't say too much about that one. Matt's sadly not with us this evening, but he wished us our best for it. So moving into the next section of the book, we've got emerging subgenres, and again a non-attendee just to kick things off, Jessica Balansagui. Apologies for that mispronunciation.
Yes. As we know,
Jess has written an absolutely fantastic piece of scholarship on the digital Gothic and this kind of vernacular internet-based sort of horror storytelling mode that has been sort of picked up and moved across into the horror mainstream through films like Slender Man and TV series like Channel Zero. This is another chapter that has kind of links to sort of TV as a horror context as well. It's a really interesting, great chapter. And it's a shame Jess isn't here to talk a little bit more about that, but I know this coincides with a lot of her work on the digital Gothic, and I would well recommend seeking out The Uncanny Child, which I think is the title of her book, which is out on Amsterdam University Press, so well worth seeking out. Apologies for keeping you waiting, contributors in the wings, but Abby, if you're still with us, survived all my ramblings, could you join us and give us a brief introduction to your chapter?
Of course, yeah.
Thank you so much.
So my chapter developed from my PhD, which I completed in June 2020, which feels both like it was yesterday and many lifetimes ago now. And so this is my first publication. So I feel very fortunate to be in such esteemed company.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Can I say that as the editor? Congratulations on your first publication.
Well done.
The thesis was a pretty comprehensive study of what I would call the Nazi horror subgenre, focusing very much on the 21st century, which is why I sort of link in with this collection. So this chapter uses Nazi horror to explore the term subgenre, as well as the concept of cycles. So I suggest that while these two terms are sometimes used in quite unclear ways or even conflated, they can actually have quite an impact on how we understand a corpus of films. So defining them is useful, particularly for horror films. And that's certainly the case when considering the breadth and depth of Nazi horror, which has seen such a marked resurgence in the 21st century. So I get the opportunity in this chapter to think about zombies, werewolves and vampires, so using subgenres to explore all that hybridity and how those overlap. And having stepped back and taken a breath after the PhD, the release of this collection has proven the perfect reinvigoration of the research. So I've just this week begun filling out a book proposal form. So hopefully I can build on the foundations of this chapter and talk about Nazi horror more widely. And I even watched a new Nazi horror film at the weekend, Ghosts of War, which Eddie pointed out to me, going above and beyond as editor.
Oh yeah, I saw it in Sainsbury's and I thought, now I know someone who's going to enjoy that. So
I think
make a photo of it.
The
Was
most
it any good?
interested in it in the world, perhaps more so than anyone involved in the film. I was.
Was it any good? Are any of them?
In terms of quality, it was very interesting for me. It does some new things. It both reinforces and challenges some.
What is your favourite Nazi horror film? Sorry, I don't know why. I'm just curious.
I think actually the Outpost series. I actually do enjoy, and it's got really interesting things. There's a trilogy, and the third one I think was a direct-to-DVD, but I think has some of the most interesting aspects. It is not Werewolves of the Third Reich. I know that Craig will probably be familiar with all of the werewolf ones, which are some of the most suspect of the subgenre.
I think it's interesting how it kind of operates as this this continuation of like the B-movie tradition, like as you know, its roots as like an exploitation subgenre, and now it's still kind of like largely, you know, off the mainstream with a few exceptions. So again, it's sort of like looking at that sort of continuation into the 21st century, which is kind of what this collection's all about. So congratulations, you've had lots and lots of, I just want to say in the chat here, you've had at least a dozen people congratulating you on the recent completion of your PhD. So I'd like to echo that and say, you know, it's a great piece of work, and thank you ever so much for joining us on the book. And I'm certain you're going to get a contract for the monograph, and I very much look forward to reading that. So I expect a signed copy. But, yeah. So yeah. Anything else you want to sort of say about it, or is that?
I was thinking with all the chat about methodology, it got me thinking that although I found psychoanalysis to be a touchstone, and I stand by the use of the uncanny and abjection as really useful lenses for the monsters that I've looked at least. But
I think you're one of the people that Steve owes an apology to.
I took it very personally. But as soon as he said that, I do think they are ways into less sort of personal trauma and formative childhood traumas, and thinking a lot more about cultural and national trauma. And I do think I need to think a lot more about that term exploitation. I've warned against it in the past, in that it can still be used in reductive ways. I don't think anyone in this call would use it in a reductive way, but it has been used to sort of dismiss Nazi exploitation before. And I think it can be used to understand its meaning alongside some of those more sort of industrial and economic contexts. So I'm going to look into that further.
It's interesting how like Overlord a couple of years ago sort of showed it sort of bleeding over into the mainstream with like a large studio movie. I think, was it J.J. Abrams, was he involved?
Yeah, that was one of the bigger productions, and it popped up in the Netflix top 10 during lockdown at some point. So people are
probably beside Bridgerton and Emily in Paris or something. So let's not talk about the top 10. But yeah, sorry, I might actually get some hate for that. I take it back. Bridgerton's fun. I really enjoyed it. I realise in a public forum, bad-mouthing Bridgerton might be a really risky move. Anyway, thank you ever so much, Abby. It's a really great piece of writing, and we're really happy to host you there for your first publication, and congratulations with everything. Yeah. So if we move on to Lindsay, any chance you can join us and introduce your chapter for us?
Hey, yeah, so this chapter is about desktop horror films. And a lot of this chapter came from my teaching. I was when I came over to the UK in 2013, and like a year later, I was thrust into this module called Cinema of Affect. And I didn't really know much about affect theory. And the more I kind of read around it, and the more I kind of really came to love it, and reading the work of Steven Shaviro kind of inspired me, especially his work on post-cinema. And so I was teaching that, and then I also watched Nacho Vigalondo's film Open Windows. And so those kind of things started festering in my mind, and I firstly did a conference paper on the topic for Fear 2000, and then kind of expanded on it for this chapter. One of the things I kind of responded to with affect and all this talk about methodologies, I think affect certainly has grown in the past, I guess, couple of decades. And certainly a lot of affect is responding or opposing psychoanalytical interpretations, and looking at more about the experience of watching films, them becoming these bodily events, but also alongside that you can kind of bring in kind of political aspects as well. So I think it's a really good kind of methodology to kind of look at films through. So I do a term on horror and sci-fi, and looking at found footage, and then these desktop films, which kind of started around 2014. There was quite a few films. There was Open Window, The Den, and Unfriended, all came out in quite quick succession, and they're very much related to the found footage subgenre. We've got Shelley here. I'm sure she can talk much more about this better than I can. But yeah, with the desktop horror films, I just thought it was really interesting, this whole idea of what Steven Shaviro talks about this idea of post-cinema, the fact that cinema has changed. It started off as analog and has become a primarily digital format. And of course, the way that we live our lives, especially right now, is through is digitally, and this whole idea that everything we're doing is kind of being processed as code, and then we kind of have to kind of we then process it ourselves, and that's also through the body at the same time. So kind of looking at all these different ideas and through these types of films that kind of came up and then went away. I mean, one of the things I was worried about is that, I wrote this chapter a couple of years ago, and I was like, oh God, there's like none of these films being made anymore. And then thank God that film Host came out last year. Yeah. Because that's kind of reinvigorated it, because now, of course, we're all living our lives through Zoom, because we're all kind of trapped indoors, but yet still connecting with each other. So hopefully that might.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, Lindsay. It's reinvigorated it, but your chapter is also quite important. I know there's been a delay with publication, but that's academic publication. But your chapter is quite important at this moment, where people talk about something like the Host, and other lockdown-inspired media as being something new this year because of the situation. But there is actually that longer history, which you really usefully chart in that chapter. And it inspired me to go out, and I'd seen some of these films, but I hadn't seen Open Windows, and boy, that is a weird film, isn't it?
It kind of loses it a bit towards the end, but the first kind of 2/3, I was like, yeah, really totally with it. Yeah.
I thought for a moment there you were talking about your chapter, and I was like, no, it's great up until the end.
Yeah. I must say, Lindsay, if you wrote this chapter now, I think it would have been even more horrifying than when you originally wrote it, because it's so funny kind of reading through this, which you're very right to point out, the fact that we live our lives online kind of from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep. And I think, you know, there was some pleasure in having some distance from that when I was certainly first reading your chapter, thinking that's other, you know. I don't really Skype that much, but now I spend pretty much my entire life on Zoom. It's even more horrifying thinking about those films, and you know, it does really make you question how much of our lives we do spend online. So yeah, I'm glad you wrote it when you did.
Our sense of self and our relationships are all being mediated through the technology we use. It's the whole idea that we can have friends that you never actually really meet, and
exactly.
Two things actually, Lindsay, that sort of like spring up from that one for me, which I think are quite interesting. Firstly is that the way in which technology, and certainly like haunted technology, has this kind of recurring sort of like, it's like a mainstay of the horror genre, that, you know, when new tech comes out, the horror genre are always going to jump in on it and, you know, do something interesting with it. But also beyond that, like the question from more of a production perspective of the resourcefulness of like horror filmmakers and using like what's available to you. So, you know, from found footage being kind of a good example of that, but also, you know, like Host was made possible by the lockdown as well as a comment on the lockdown. So I don't know if there's anything about sort of, you know, that and making these films that I think that resonates for you. I'm not sure.
What I think is really interesting, and it started off with what you probably could term the first kind of desktop horror, which is the section, the sick thing that happened to Emily when she was younger, from VHS, which was directed by Joe Swanberg, and how they made that. They didn't use a camera. It was all done through coordinating Skype. And I think Host I'm sure would be the same, that nothing has been filmed with a camera. So it's completely like this whole idea, is it cinema? And I mentioned Shelley before, and a couple of years ago, we did a live tweeting of the Snapchat film Sick House. And that's all done in the vertical video format and released through Snapchat. And again, I was thinking, how is this cinema? Like, because it's the vertical format, but it's really interesting. But so it's again, this whole idea of cinema is completely changing. And I mean, and also alongside that, you know, what Jonathan was talking about in terms of fandom there, you know, and the transmedia aspect of these films is that, you know, using advertising and the whole idea of fandom and labor, that, you know, while we're participating in these media products, we're also kind of doing the advertising work for them as well. So there's really so many different kind of areas that you can explore.
Yeah, you couldn't actually script a better segue into talking about horror in the world than talking about the horror of living your life inside a desktop. So that's a perfect sort of setup for the last part of the book, which is called Horror in the World, and there's 3 chapters in here. The first of which is my chapter, which you've all heard me speak far too much. I'm sorry for going on. I've just kind of been rolling with it here. I found a new sort of like lease of life. I was like, I don't want to have to do too much talking this evening, and now you literally cannot shut me up. So apologies.
You're enjoying being the host, aren't you, Eddie?
I'm loving it. Yeah, I feel like I've always, now I just know that I need to make a podcast. So anyway, so the first chapter.
You heard it here first, people. You heard it here.
Yeah, don't quote me on that. I got enough jobs. So the first chapter in the last section is my chapter, Revisiting the Female Monster, Sex and Monstrosity in Contemporary Body Horror. So yeah, this is my sort of contribution to the book. It kind of coincides with like my sort of more general interests in the horror genre as well. Not so much about these close readings of films, although there's plenty of that in that chapter, but more about kind of like horror spectatorship and what people kind of gain from horror. as kind of like a site of refuge, or as something that's kind of like pleasurable, and so on and so forth. Like horror audiences have kind of this kind of links back to sort of what Steve was talking about at the beginning, about the sort of the way in which like horror reception has been engineered in certain ways by these forces working from the outside, the media, journalism, who's telling us that this stuff is disgusting, you shouldn't be watching this, people who watch this are wrong and stuff. But it kind of actually erases the real sort of pleasures and values that people quite clearly take from the horror genre. So I kind of look at the question of sort of sex and monstrosity. I talk about a load of films. There's reference to Teeth as kind of like sort of an entry text into the sort of like cycle that I go through. But It Follows being a film about sex and horror as well, and I kind of cap it all off with a piece on Julia Ducournau's great sort of cannibal vampire coming of age sex horror movie, Raw, which I'm guessing no one in this chat's not seen Raw, but if you haven't, go and watch Raw. I wrote down the title of Bloody Muscle Bodybuilders when you were talking about earlier, John, just in case anyone couldn't write it down quickly enough. But Raw, I'm sure you all know. So yeah, that's my chapter, and I won't say too much more about that because we do have our final two contributors. David has just said Raw is finger licking good.
It really is. I love that.
That's the quote that they needed on the DVD case.
Are we going to get in trouble for some sort of trademark use there or not?
Yeah.
Other types of finger licking are available.
Well, apparently KFC are doing like a games console, so why not get into sort of horror production as well? So Tom is with us as well. Well, I hope you're still with us, Tom. I can't see you at the top, but are you still with us, Tom?
Yeah,
No.
give us a second, mate. I'm just going to turn my webcam on. If you just give us a sec, 2 seconds. I've been doing, there we are. Is that working?
I can see you, yeah.
2 seconds. I'll try and, I think it's the wrong
So
camera.
whilst Tom sorts out his tech issues, Tom and I are actually
there we go.
co-editing a book together on the films of Nick Vinding Refn, which we're putting together at the moment for Edinburgh University Press. So, Tom's not seen the back of me yet with the end of New Blood, so... Right, Tom, can you tell us a little bit about your?
It's a lovely partnership, mate. I'm not gonna lie.
Beginning of
yeah, so it's a bit of a strange one. My inclusion in the books. I think I was initially. Hello.
Oh, you're cutting in and out a little bit.
Can hear you.
Wait there. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear. Well, I can hear that, but I couldn't hear anything before that.
Ghosts in the Machine, how apt, following the chapter description before. So my chapter is slightly a bit of a weird story about mine, because I think I was initially contacted for inclusion in the book following a recommendation from Neil, who's going to follow me, the showstopper chapter, as it were. And I was initially going to write a chapter about cosmic horror and interdimensional kind of horror and things like that, so looking at things like The Void and a bit of H.P. Lovecraft kind of influence aesthetics and things like that. But I think when I was thinking about other ideas, and the call for papers went out for the FIA 2000 conference in 2018, talking about horror cinema and kind of the influence of horror as it was associated to contemporary world politics and things like that. I ended up thinking about Jeremy Saulnier's Green Room, which was obviously quite of the moment at the time, with the rise of the visibility of the alt-right in the US coming to light and kind of causing a lot of issues in the media and things like that, as well as in reality. So I think I ended up giving a conference paper on one of the best panels that I think's been programmed, called Make America Hate Again, which was really apt, which I think has since been not pilfered, shall we say, but it's kind of the name of a collection about horror cinema, or cinema more broadly, in the Trump era. And it's kind of, it was an abstract that I put together, and I think I peaked a little bit early in my career with the title, which I'm very proud of. The Kids Are Alt-Right, Hardcore Punk, Subcultural Violence and Contemporary American Politics in Jeremy Saulnier's Green Room. So I did think it was a kind of last minute change for an inclusion in the book, which you were quite happy to take on board, which was really good. So effectively what the chapter does, it is very sort of textual analysis heavy, and situating the film within the kind of contemporaneous cultural moment in the US, and kind of reflecting on Jeremy Saulnier's own self-confessed autobiographical experiences of being a member of the punk scene in the late 80s and early 90s America, and kind of being at odds within that scene when you have kind of conflicting ideologies of what punk means, and the kind of fascist elements and this kind of neo-Nazi, neo-fascist skinhead elements within that particular scene, which seems to kind of come to a head within that particular movie. And it seemed to me at the time that this was doing something really interesting in terms of, you know, representing this within a horror film, but also kind of commenting upon tensions within subcultural discourse as well. And that was kind of an area where I was between in terms of my own research, or kind of moving away from horror studies a little bit into more research around music and how subcultures are represented in cinema more broadly. So hopefully this particular chapter on Saulnier's movie is going to become part of a larger project on punksploitation films, which I have been in discussions very informally with Johnny, who's on the call at the moment, about pitching that for the Global Exploitation Cinemas book series for Bloomsbury. So hopefully that'll kind of gestate into a wider project alongside the 1,000,001 things I've got going on in the meantime with yourself, Eddie. Obviously the Refn book will come first. Don't worry about that. So yeah, it was kind of an opportunity to talk about two of my really sort of big interests, because I think it's been touched upon, fans of horror and fans of the things that we talk about, maybe first and foremost, at least initially. And I kind of, part of, various punk scenes, and kind of that's the kind of go-to music that I listen to. This film, when I seen it, seemed to be for me, I guess, in a roundabout way. And it was really just a kind of sort of constellation of all those kind of things I was interested in talking about. And unfortunately, obviously, with the last couple of weeks, we've seen insurrections at the White House, and various members of, people who would be considered to be members of the alt-right, although I don't think it's been discussed in those ways recently. Certainly members of the Proud Boys and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of unfortunately meant that a lot of the issues that I'm talking about still remain, and have remained, quite problematic and quite pervasive in the US culture, and obviously in the global politics sort of more broadly. So yeah, it's kind of, on the one thing, I really enjoyed writing it, but on the one hand, kind of reflecting on it, I have the chapter sent as a PDF for ref purposes, kind of reading back through it, just how kind of problematic it is in terms of the politics that the film discusses, and how that's resonating in the world at the moment, which I guess makes the film quite textually relevant alongside some of the other films that people have been discussing as well. I am going to be quiet now, because I think it's going to kind of turn into a bit of a rambling rant, and I know that Neil would like to talk about a Serbian film as well, so I guess that's all I have to say at the moment.
Thanks ever so much, Tom. That's a really great introduction. As David points out in the chat over here, it's a shame that your decision to switch this to a chapter about the alt-right proved to be so irrelevant.
Yeah.
No, it's I tell you what, this will come back to be it'll be your moment in about 5 to 10 years time. You're going to have like 2,000 citations on Google Scholar, because everyone's going to be writing their dissertations about the current political moment, and they're going to be like, "Oh, this guy's talking about the kids not being alt-right in New Blood," and it'll be the making of us all. But yeah, it's a really great chapter, talking about a really important sort of turn in American politics, and looking at it through the lens of this one particular film. And as you say, nicely sort of segues into your other big interest, which is music. So
yeah, of course.
Must have been a nice sort of thing for you to do.
Well, it's kind of testing the waters almost, of kind of moving into that as well. So it's been received quite well from you guys, which I really appreciate.
There was a shout out by Shelley to the Void as well, so it's a shame we didn't see that. And I suppose it does put attention to the fact that if there's any future reviewers of this book among us, we were not trying to be exhaustive. There's obviously omissions in the book in terms of the current sort of state of horror. And actually, very quickly before we turn to Neil, who I do apologise, Neil. We put you last because as Tom said, showstopper. But it means that
The book goes out with a bang, quite literally.
You've been hanging around waiting for me to get to you. So I do apologise. But very quickly, Laura has just posted a few things from the chat to cover. Given people have identified that there's obviously the inevitability of publishing delays and subsequent film releases, and especially when you're advertising your book about the contemporary moment, this is particularly pertinent. So are there any new cycles, filmmakers, contexts which have emerged since the commissioning of the collection that any of us would like to talk about? I was talking to Joe about this earlier. Like, I'm so out of date with horror films. I'm actually about like a year behind now. I watched a couple of them, like Our House on Netflix is fantastic. But like,
you mean His House?
His House, that's it.
Yeah,
Our House is the madness song, isn't it? Tom, you got me thinking about music now. Not Our House, His House. But I haven't even seen St. Maud yet, so I'm a little bit out of the loop on that.
I haven't seen St. Maud yet. I've got the DVD pre-ordered though, because I keep hearing nothing but good things, so I'm looking forward to that.
It seems to be a clear moment for horror, you know, as this kind of this always kind of like just on the outside of the mainstream genre that's sort of like stepping over into the sort of like, you know, kind of just general film consciousness. We've seen like massive blockbusters with the likes of It and the sequel to that film, you know, making huge money at the box office. You've seen other kind of horror adjacent films doing really well critically, like Shape of Water being horror-ish. It's got horror elements. It's a monster movie. And, you know, Parasite even kind of having sort of like hybrid horror-y elements as well. So yeah, absolutely. Like, you know, already there's probably, you know, if people in the audience thinking, you know, New Blood is probably, you know, put in your application now, because in a 3 to 4 years time, it's all going to look different once again. I've become more interested myself in sort of like not just spectatorship, but like horror productions. Actually, quick shout out, personal plug here, because the call for papers is still active. Myself and Alice Haylett-Bryan have got a call for papers out at the moment on global horror production in the 21st century. And we've already got some really great horror scholars tied to that book, which is more specifically looking at production contexts rather than the films themselves. So I suppose going back to that question you asked earlier, Johnny, about methodological sort of directions for horror studies going forward, I'm more interested in, you know, the inherent transnationality of the horror genre and how these films are being sort of made across borders. Obviously speaking to pertinent political, social moments, but at the same time sort of are expressive of kind of filmmaking production tactics in sort of this increasingly globalized and digital age that we live in. Okay, so I've just seen that question has now since been answered in the chat, so I will stop on that one. Neil, thank you ever so much for your patience. As Tom's already introduced you as the showstopper, could you come and tell us a little bit about 21st Century Euro Snuff, a Serbian film for the family?
I'm not so much a showstopper, I'm more of a terminal statement, I think. Yeah, I mean, I was really grateful to have the opportunity to kind of complete a circle, really, as far as what I've been doing over the last few years is concerned. I mean, I wrote a piece on Cannibal Holocaust in the early noughties. And of course, it was a film which at the time was already starting to kind of percolate finally into the popular culture, I suppose, more broadly, as that new wave of found footage films emerged. But what really interested me about that film was the way in which it offered a variation upon this cultural mythology of the snuff film. So I had the opportunity to say a whole lot more about myself, Johnny Walker, Tom Watson, and Sean Kimber when we edited our collection, Snuff, Real, Deaf and Film Media, Screen Media, sorry. And I also had the opportunity to say more in a couple of chapters. But the one thing that always bugged me, and it's an itch I was dying to scratch, was the fact that we didn't really have an extensive piece on a Serbian film, which seemed to be something which was absolutely essential in terms of bringing all of the issues, all of the debates that have emerged with regards to this mythology of the snuff film are concerned. So, and when I actually sat down and looked at the film again for the first time in a few years, I was struck by the fact that there was so much that you could say about it. I mean, in the meantime, several people had written about it. It was always through the lens of censorship, through the lens of reception, it's through the lens of Balkan history. What I really suppose wanted to do was to reclaim the film for genre study, have a look at it as a, for lack of a better term, horror film. And again, I could see, looking at the film structurally, thematically, just how much it was drawing upon the kind of tradition that many of us in the snuff collection and many other writers besides, going way back, had kind of identified as being the key tropes, the key ideas, as far as the mythology of the snuff film is concerned. So one of the other things I really wanted to address, as far as the as far as the piece was concerned as well, was how it works as a critical object. Now, as far as the critical community was concerned, certainly in this country, there was what I found to be a highly ironic response, in the sense that I tend to think of year zero of the of snuff film fiction, Peeping Tom, a British film from 1960. And the critics back then were absolutely scathing. They absolutely destroyed the film, and quite famously, it was very detrimental to the career of its director as well. And what I found to be quite amusing in the critical response to a Serbian film in 2011 was the fact that the British critical establishment was again seizing up on this film, which covered many of the same themes, but updated, of course, for the digital age, what you might call the pornographic age, I suppose, which again, Tom was very much ahead of the game in terms of covering that as well. But it was a film which the critics more or less repeated themselves. Of course, it was a whole different critical community, but they more or less repeated themselves in heaping this series of moral judgments upon this supposedly reprehensible film. For example, people like Mark Kermode, who historically is very much a supporter of the horror film, and he was absolutely scathing in his condemnation of the film. So it was interesting to have a kind of look at his comments and other writers like Peter Bradshaw in The Guardian, but also to look at some of the more positive views as well. People, what you would call horror savvy critics, people like Kim Newman, Rick Somo, writing in Watchdog, and one or two other people did have some positive things to say about it. So it was a film which was very, very divisive in terms of the opinions that it elicited. But in terms of the actual themes of the film as well, I was really interested in how it was really, really concentrating upon this notion of the family unit, which again we know has been central to horror in so many ways through the decades, certainly since the 1970s. And the way it seizes upon the family unit as a kind of oppositional force to these what you call this kind of pornographic subculture which the film represents. So in many ways, regardless of all of its surface extremities and so on, going back to the theme that Steve outlined earlier, it's quite a conservative film in many ways, because it's kind of despairing in its view of the family as something which has kind of been destroyed and downtrodden by these kind of oppressive institutional forces that it presents to us. So yeah, I wanted to summarize. I just wanted to reclaim the film for criticism in that way, and in particular for genre criticism, and to try and take it away from those ideas and those issues have always informed discussions of extreme cinema, which, as Steve pointed out, those kind of issues, those kinds of responses to extreme cinema, we all have different parameters as far as the extreme is concerned. When I talked about the film at FIA 2000 conference a year and a half ago, a couple of years ago, I was surprised at how many horror scholars hadn't seen it. It seems like even horror scholars themselves have their own range tastes and parameters of where they will go and where they will draw the line. Yeah, that's more or less sums up why and how I approach this piece.
Well, yeah, thanks, Neil. It's a really it's a chapter that's far too beautifully written for its subject matter. It's a really wonderful piece of writing. Joe and I were talking about this the other day, where the moment we realised that you actually don't use subsections or anything like that in it, it's just this continued piece of like fantastic prose about this film. And I suppose it's interesting, sort of at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about, these chapters that are doing discourse analysis and, all about sort of these contexts, the ways in which people talk about horror and horror reception. And you kind of strip that away to some extent and focus on sort of like the tropes of the film itself and kind of just explore it as a text to be analyzed, sort of, outside of that discussion of whether or not it's okay to make or watch or even enjoy a Serbian film. And I think that's what's really great about that chapter, is it kind of brings us back to sort of like that sort of primary interest of sort of like looking at the film itself as this really interesting sort of cultural object. So
yeah, I mean, I still think I still very much believe there's a place for criticism, and much of the work that I do, I'm rating at the moment, it combines textual and critical content. So I'm always very happy to read critical accounts. And I know it's not so fashionable today in film studies in general, certainly because, again, this whole issue of subjective approaches to individual cultural objects or works of art, if we can call them that. There's a move more towards extensive audience analysis and audience research. I'm all for a incisive and well-reasoned and well-argued critical account from the individual writer.
Yeah. Did you ever? I remember sending you a link of that they were selling the baby. Do you remember I sent you that from the Serbian?
That's right. Yeah.
Did you ever buy it? Can we turn the camera and see?
No, it was outside of my price range, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure some sick pervert somewhere has got it hanging up in their bathroom. Yeah.
Yeah. Taking pleasure in the film is one thing, but buying the props for the infamous infant scene is another thing entirely.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really fantastic way of sort of ending the collection as well. As I say, sort of like if the book begins with that discourse analysis, it sort of ends with what on the surface is kind of a more straightforward film analysis, but as it is actually this really deep interrogation of kind of the tropes of horror cinema and the effects of horror cinema that I think. Halves of Darkness by Tony Williams is the sort of like, we were talking about Creed and that and Clover earlier, and that's one of those other books that sort of talks about the family as this kind of like really important element of the horror film, and it sort of like throws back to sort of what horror studies has been doing sort of all along so well, which is sort of kind of talking about these social issues, but with really interesting types of formal experimentation.
Yeah, I mean, the Tony Williams book was, it was a kind of a touchstone for when I was writing that piece. And I suspect that it's a film that he wouldn't approve of, because again, the film clings to the notion of the family as a positive cornerstone of what you might call middle class bourgeois culture, or as he would probably refer to it. Whereas his book, his argument, and this again was central to Robin Hood's. And Robin and Tony Williams, I think, were very much closely aligned at one stage. Were very critical of the notion of the family as a kind of centerpiece, as a cornerstone of so much Hollywood narrative cinema. So I suspect that Tony Williams probably wouldn't approve of a Serbian film on that level and in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of I often think of a Serbian film as like sort of bearing sort of some resemblance to those sort of was it Jorga Butarite. I can't pronounce his name.
Jorga Butarite.
Necromancer and the like.
Yeah.
I wonder if that comparison. I don't know what you think about that comparison.
Well, as as the same thing, really. I mean, they come from a very, very generalized European tradition, and this is a point that I think I raised in the article briefly. To conflate that kind of European tradition is quite, isn't necessarily very productive. Necromantic films, they're shot on, I think, 16mm, certainly I don't think he's ever gone beyond 16mm in any of the films that he made, Bucharest. And they come from a kind of German underground tradition, whereas a Serbian film was very obviously an attempt to make an exportable and again, this sounds quite perverse, a commercially viable feature film, because it looks so slick, it is so professionally done. I think this was one of the reasons it had such an impact around the globe and was so roundly condemned and, of course, outlawed in some regions. But it's so slick and it's so well done. And I think what Butgerite's film has, which a Serbian film aspires to but doesn't necessarily achieve, is the veneer of underground art, you know. And it has this notion of the author Butgerite who's kind of working against the conventional establishment, and that's why I think the film has kind of lasted, and it's now acceptable in this country, of course, after many years of being unavailable. It's now acceptable to put it out in a nice, shiny, digital, uncut Blu-ray, whereas a Serbian film has never really been afforded that privilege. Probably it's 10 years this year since it was first released.
Speaking earlier, sort of like going back to John's,
in the UK.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, going back to John's chapter about sort of, you know,
horror.
I was just saying, going back very quickly to John's chapter about sort of, you know, DVD releases and consumption. I know that Unearthed Films, who do some of the films that Steve's talking about in his chapter, like the Flowers and Lung, are about to release like a region-free, full uncut version of a Serbian film in like the deluxe package or something. So
okay, well, I'm conscious I'll stop talking because I can now just be asking questions. So again,
yeah,
thanks for the opportunity, and it's great to be part of the collection.
Thanks ever so much, Neil. It's a really great chapter, and it's a
thank you, Neil, and
cheers,
thank
Neil.
you everyone else as well. We're conscious of time. There's been a couple of last minute questions coming in. One a cheeky question from Kate. Thank you for this question though, Kate. I saw in the chat. Do you think there's any likelihood of a New Blood Volume 2? We were thinking about this earlier, you know, and it was briefly mentioned that the field has changed so much since we first, you know, started putting the plans forward in the proposal for this book. But one thing I would say, I think there's scope for this in the future. There's always scope for more horror scholarship in the future, whether it's through us or through other researchers. But also, I would say a lot of the areas that we did want to cover originally in this book are being covered by the other books in the series. The horror series being published by University Wales Press. There are some great other books coming out which do touch on areas that we did originally have plans to hopefully cover in the book, which didn't sadly come to fruition. So yeah, and also it's great to hear that some of these chapters that people have kindly put forward for our collection are leading on to, you know, longer monograph works. So both David and Tom have mentioned that. So I think lots of other people are going to pick up the baton if it's not us three, I think, in future, aren't they?
Yeah, there's going to be a deluge of chapters in the next like 5 years.
Although everyone in the chat is now suggesting, you know, what our title should be for Volume 2.
Post Blood.
Post Blood. Oh God.
I'll only sign on if it's called Two Blood, Two Furious, as Laura says.
That is amazing. Yes, thank you, Laura.
Yeah, I'm sure there's, you know, there's chapters being written as we speak about Ari Aster and more stuff from Robert Eggers. I've got a chapter in the next issue of Journal of Horror Studies on sort of extreme art house horror, and I talk about Eggers and stuff in that as well. So there's almost certainly like scholarship being generated as we speak about some of these new emergent talents. And you know, we've seen other great works of like horror scholarship come out. You know, Women Make Horror, you know, recently as well, which is sort of you know, reorienting attention towards you know, sort of the lack of kind of scholarship, you know, sort of by women about women that sort of tends to sort of like populate horror studies. So it's a really interesting time for horror from like a film fan's perspective, but also an academic's perspective, and you know, as a student's perspective as well. So yeah, I think I don't know. Laura, do you want to jump in and close things up, or am I supposed to?
Tell us to
Shut
be
it
quiet
down.
now, if you have to.
Tell you to be quiet.
Oh, please do. That's what I need. There should be a poke button.
Can you
Like,
please
shut up.
mute him, Laura? Mute him.
This would be
Already.
45 minutes.
You
Need
can
the
stop now.
eject button
Okay,
on
no,
Zoom,
we
don't
are out of time. We said 1:30, and I'm aware that people are having to drift off quite quickly. So I'd like to wrap things up just by saying congratulations again on the book, and thank you so much for talking to us this evening, and for all of your fantastic contributors as well who took part. Really lovely to hear about everybody's work. I've read the book as it goes, and it's a fantastic collection, highly recommended. So I hope you sell many copies and make enough to buy yourself a beer, you know,
Yeah.
as is the way of academic publishing.
That is the way, isn't
I've
it?
spent it in advance.
Yeah, I've wasted mine on spirits. Cheers anyway to the book.
Well, it was a launch, yes. All right, well, I'm sure everybody will join me in thanking the editors, Eddie and Joe and John once more, and congratulate them on their publication. Thanks, guys.
Thank you
Yes,
very
Thank
much.
you very much for having us, Laura.
Thank you for having us.
Great, thank you.
And thank you to all the contributors that came along as well. Thank you all so much.